Russian politicians have declared that a reported U.S. strike ordered by former President Donald Trump against Venezuela would be unlawful and destabilizing, and those words echo loudly not because they come from Moscow, but because they force Americans to confront a recurring question about our own power, our own process, and our own constitutional discipline. The United States has long understood that global leadership does not come merely from military capacity, but from legitimacy, from the perception that American action is anchored in law, deliberation, and democratic accountability. When foreign governments accuse the United States of acting outside international norms, the reflexive response is often to dismiss the criticism as propaganda or geopolitical rivalry. Yet history shows that when such accusations align with unresolved questions at home, they deserve scrutiny rather than dismissal. At the core of this controversy is not Russia, and not Venezuela, but the American system of governance itself. The Constitution places the power to declare war in the hands of Congress, a deliberate check born from the founders' fear of unilateral executive adventurism. Over time, presidents of both parties have stretched that boundary, citing national security imperatives, authorizations for use of military force passed decades ago, or the inherent powers of the commander-in-chief. Each expansion has been justified as temporary, exceptional, and necessary. Each has, in practice, become precedent. When foreign observers claim that an American strike lacks legality, they are often pointing not to their own interpretation of law, but to the visible erosion of our internal guardrails. Venezuela itself has been a focal point of U.S. policy debates for years, framed through the lenses of human rights abuses, democratic backsliding, economic collapse, and regional instability. Successive administrations have imposed sanctions, recognized opposition figures, and applied diplomatic pressure, arguing that these measures support democratic restoration. Critics, both domestic and international, have countered that sanctions have deepened humanitarian suffering and hardened authoritarian control. Any escalation from economic or diplomatic pressure to direct military action would therefore represent not an isolated decision, but a dramatic shift in policy with consequences far beyond Caracas. It would signal to allies and adversaries alike that the threshold for American force remains uncertain and highly personalized. Russian officials labeling such a strike unlawful is hardly surprising given Moscow's strategic interests in Latin America and its broader contest with Washington. Yet their rhetoric resonates because it taps into an existing global skepticism about American consistency. The United States has championed sovereignty and non-intervention when convenient, while invoking humanitarian necessity or preemptive defense when it suits strategic aims. This duality has been a recurring theme since the Cold War, from Iran in 1953 to Iraq in 2003, each episode leaving behind lessons that remain unresolved in the public conscience. American credibility has never rested on claims of perfection, but on the willingness to reckon openly with mistakes and recalibrate policy accordingly. Public sentiment within the United States reflects fatigue with endless conflicts and opaque justifications. Polling over the last decade has consistently shown bipartisan skepticism toward new military interventions, particularly those without clear congressional authorization or defined objectives. Veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan have returned home carrying not only physical and psychological scars, but stories of missions that shifted without explanation and victories that never fully materialized. Against this backdrop, any report of a unilateral strike raises immediate questions: who authorized it, under what legal framework, and toward what end? These questions are not partisan traps, they are democratic necessities. The American system was designed to slow decisions of war precisely because their consequences are irreversible. James Madison warned that no nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare, a warning echoed by generations who understood that emergency powers, once normalized, rarely recede. When presidents act swiftly and decisively without transparent consultation, they may project strength abroad, but they risk weakening the democratic fabric at home. Russian accusations of destabilization, then, intersect with a deeper anxiety among Americans themselves about the drift of power toward the executive branch. Historically, U.S. interventions in Latin America have left a complicated legacy. From the Monroe Doctrine to the Cold War-era interventions justified as anti-communism, American involvement has often been framed as stabilizing, only to produce long-term instability and resentment. Venezuela's political crisis did not emerge in a vacuum, nor is it solely the product of foreign interference. It is the result of years of institutional decay, corruption, and polarized leadership. Military action, even if limited, risks reinforcing narratives of imperial overreach and providing authoritarian leaders with external enemies to justify internal repression. International law, imperfect as it is, remains a cornerstone of the post-World War II order that the United States helped build. The United Nations Charter restricts the use of force to self-defense or actions authorized by the Security Council. While the U.S. has argued for broader interpretations in cases of imminent threat or humanitarian intervention, those arguments lose force when applied inconsistently. Russian officials calling a U.S. strike unlawful are not neutral arbiters, but their language mirrors critiques voiced by legal scholars and former diplomats within the United States. When internal and external criticisms converge, it suggests a problem that cannot be solved by rhetoric alone. The destabilization argument also deserves careful examination. Venezuela sits within a region already strained by migration, economic inequality, and political polarization. Millions of Venezuelans have fled to neighboring countries, creating humanitarian pressures that ripple across borders. Any military escalation could exacerbate these flows, strain regional governments, and invite external actors to deepen their involvement. The United States has often argued that its actions aim to promote stability and democracy, yet history shows that force can just as easily fracture societies and empower the most hardline actors. Domestic governance cannot be separated from foreign policy credibility. When American institutions appear divided, when congressional oversight is sidelined, and when legal rationales are classified or retroactively constructed, adversaries exploit those weaknesses in the information space. Russian statements condemning a U.S. strike are as much about shaping global perception as they are about defending international law. The most effective response to such narratives is not denial, but demonstrable adherence to constitutional process and transparent debate. The role of Congress is central here. The War Powers Resolution was enacted to reclaim legislative authority after Vietnam, yet it has been repeatedly circumvented or ignored. Members of Congress often criticize executive actions after the fact, but rarely assert their authority beforehand. This abdication contributes to the very perception of lawlessness that foreign critics amplify. A serious commitment to democratic governance would require lawmakers to debate, authorize, or reject military action openly, regardless of political risk. American democratic values are not abstract ideals, they are practices that must be renewed through use. Open debate, dissent, and accountability are not signs of weakness, but of strength. When the United States acts abroad, it carries with it the weight of its own example. If that example appears to privilege speed over deliberation and power over process, it undermines decades of advocacy for rule-based order. Russian accusations, though self-serving, exploit the gap between American ideals and American actions. Policy shifts driven by individual leaders rather than institutional consensus are particularly vulnerable to reversal and backlash. One administration's assertive stance can be undone by the next, leaving allies uncertain and adversaries emboldened. The question is not whether the United States should respond to crises or threats, but how it does so in a way that aligns with its constitutional framework and long-term national direction. Venezuela represents a test case of whether lessons from past interventions have been absorbed or merely archived. The American public's role in this equation is often underestimated. Sustained engagement, skepticism, and demand for clarity are essential to democratic control of foreign policy. When citizens accept ambiguity or defer entirely to executive judgment, they inadvertently contribute to the erosion of checks and balances. Russian commentary labeling a U.S. strike destabilizing resonates because it reflects a global expectation that American power should be restrained by its own laws. Failing to meet that expectation carries strategic costs. Historical memory matters. The Iraq War, justified in part by claims later proven false, permanently altered global trust in U.S. intelligence assessments and decision-making. Even when subsequent actions are grounded in more credible evidence, they are filtered through that legacy of doubt. Any report of a strike on Venezuela would inevitably be interpreted through that lens, both at home and abroad. Restoring confidence requires not only accurate information, but visible respect for process. The United States has often positioned itself as a defender of democratic movements, yet democracy cannot be imposed by force without contradiction. Sustainable political change emerges from internal legitimacy, institutions, and civic culture. External pressure may create space, but military action risks closing it. Russian officials calling such action unlawful are asserting a narrative of American hypocrisy, one that gains traction when democratic rhetoric is paired with unilateral force. Constitutional principles are not obstacles to effective governance, they are safeguards against impulsive decisions that carry generational consequences. The framers understood that war centralizes power and suppresses dissent, which is why they dispersed authority across branches. Ignoring that design in the name of expediency invites precisely the instability that critics warn about. The question confronting Americans is whether national security is better served by bypassing debate or by embracing it, even when it slows action. The broader national direction of U.S. foreign policy remains contested. Is the goal to deter adversaries through displays of force, or to rebuild a rules-based order through alliances and institutions? Is leadership defined by dominance, or by example? Russian statements condemning a U.S. strike force a choice between reacting defensively or reflecting constructively. The latter requires confidence in democratic processes and a willingness to subject power to law. As this debate unfolds, the absence of clear, authoritative explanations fuels speculation and mistrust. Silence or vague assurances leave room for adversarial narratives to flourish. Transparency, while politically risky, is strategically sound. It allows citizens to assess the rationale, legality, and consequences of action, and it signals to the world that American democracy remains functional even under pressure. The destabilization of international norms does not occur overnight, it accumulates through exceptions that become habits. Each time force is used without clear authorization or explanation, it lowers the threshold for others to do the same. Russian officials condemning a U.S. strike are not defending a pristine legal order, but they are highlighting a trend that, if left unchecked, erodes the very framework that has limited great power conflict for decades. The United States, as an architect of that framework, bears a disproportionate responsibility to uphold it, even when doing so constrains short-term options. The enduring strength of American democracy lies not in the absence of criticism, but in its capacity to absorb it and adjust. When foreign voices accuse the United States of acting unlawfully, the instinct to circle the wagons should give way to a more confident response rooted in law, history, and accountability. That response begins with acknowledging the gravity of military force and the necessity of collective decision-making, and it continues with a renewed commitment to the constitutional balance that has guided the Republic through wars, crises, and transformations. In the absence of that commitment, power becomes personal, policy becomes erratic, and the line between leadership and destabilization grows increasingly difficult to defend as the debate over Venezuela unfolds in real time, shaping perceptions not only of one decision, but of the trajectory of American governance itself, a trajectory that remains unfinished, contested, and still subject to the choices made in moments like this, where restraint and authority must coexist, and where the next step taken without deliberation risks setting in motion consequences that no single administration can fully control, especially as global attention remains fixed on whether the United States will answer criticism with process or with impulse, and whether democratic values will be treated as guiding principles or as rhetorical instruments while the situation continues to evolve without clear resolution and with mounting pressure from all sides, leaving unanswered questions about legality, legitimacy, and the future direction of American power in a world increasingly skeptical of unilateral decisions taken at speed without the full weight of constitutional consent behind them, a skepticism that will only deepen if the pattern continues and the opportunity for deliberate, lawful action is once again deferred in favor of immediacy and perceived strength at the expense of the enduring norms that have long defined the American political experiment as it moves forward into an uncertain and highly scrutinized global moment where every action reverberates far beyond its immediate target and into the broader architecture of international order that remains fragile, contested, and dependent on the choices of those who hold the greatest influence within it. Choices that are still being made as the conversation persists and the implications continue to unfold without pause or closure, pressing onward into the next phase of this ongoing debate as policymakers, citizens, and observers alike await the next development that will further test the boundaries between authority, law, and democratic responsibility.